700 hardened outlaws stood in dead, suffocating silence. In the center of the dust-choked Mojave compound sat a paralyzed $2.5 million masterpiece. A 22-year-old runaway with grease-stained hands gripped a wrench, knowing one wrong turn of the titanium bolt wouldn't just strip the engine, it would cost him his life. The Mojave sun was a relentless, hammering anvil, baking the earth until the air above the asphalt rippled with heat distortion. It was high noon at the Iron Summit, a highly classified, heavily guarded desert compound owned by the most formidable chapter of the Hells Angels. Over 700 patched members from across the globe had descended upon the valley, their leather vests coated in a fine layer of white alkali dust. They were gathered for a single, defining event: the unveiling and inaugural ride of the Sovereign. The Sovereign wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a rolling monument, a mechanized bank vault, and an artifact of outlaw royalty. Commissioned 3 years prior by the chapter's ruthless president, Silas Montgomery, the bike had been the final masterpiece of the late Cole Briggs, a legendary custom fabricator who had taken his most fiercely guarded mechanical secrets to the grave. The Sovereign was appraised at an astronomical $2.5 million. Its frame was laced with raw, conflict-free diamonds embedded beneath layers of translucent candy apple red paint, and its engine block had been machined from a single, solid billet of weapons-grade titanium. It was a terrifyingly beautiful machine, engineered to produce a thunderous 250 horsepower. But right now, the most expensive motorcycle in outlaw history was nothing more than a lifeless paperweight. Silas Montgomery, a man whose reputation for violence was as legendary as the bike he straddled, turned the custom-milled ignition key. 700 bikers held their breath, waiting for the trademark, earth-shaking roar. Instead, there was a sickening, metallic crunch. It was the sound of internal devastation, followed by a high-pitched mechanical whine, and then a dead, absolute stall. A collective murmur rippled through the sea of leather and denim. Silas's face, usually carved from granite, contorted with a fury so dark it seemed to drop the ambient temperature of the desert. He slammed his fist against the titanium handlebars. "Dutch! Wyatt!" Silas roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Get out here! Now!" The crowd parted instantly as two of the club's most seasoned mechanics sprinted forward. Dutch, a burly man with a salt-and-pepper beard, and Wyatt, younger but with a decade of experience under his belt, dropped to their knees on the burning tarmac. They ripped open their tool rolls, sweat pouring from their foreheads, stinging their eyes. They had precisely 10 minutes to find the problem before Silas's embarrassment turned into lethal retribution. 30 yards away, watching from the oppressive shadows of a corrugated steel supply shed, stood Leo Cassidy. Leo didn't belong here. He was 22, a runaway from the south side of Chicago, fleeing a disastrous $50,000 debt owed to a ruthless loan shark named Carmine Rossi. To save his late grandfather's failing auto shop, Leo had borrowed from the wrong people, lost everything, and hopped a freight train west. He had ended up stranded in the Mojave, taken in by the club solely to sweep floors, scrub oil pans, and take out the trash in exchange for a cot and a roof for where Rossi's enforcers couldn't find him. But Leo possessed a secret. He was a savant. Raised by a grandfather who built race engines for a living, Leo could diagnose a misfire by ear from a block away. He understood the heartbeat of a combustion engine better than he understood human beings. For the next 15 minutes, Leo watched in agonizing silence as Dutch and Wyatt tore off the Sovereign's primary cover, frantically checking spark plugs, fuel lines, and the electronic control unit. "The ECU is throwing ghost codes, boss," Dutch stammered, his hands trembling violently as he held a diagnostic scanner. The fuel pump is priming, but the crank won't turn. It's completely seized. It's dead. Cole Briggs built this engine to outlast a nuclear strike, Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. He stepped off the bike, unbuckling the heavy leather belt around his waist. And you're telling me, in front of 700 of my brothers, that my $2.5 million bike is dead? Wyatt took a step back, raising his hands. Silas, we need a machine shop. We need an engine hoist. We can't fix this in the dirt. Silas wrapped the leather belt around his knuckles. The 700 bikers formed a tight, suffocating ring around the broken machine and the doomed mechanics. The tension was a physical weight pressing down on the compound. Leo couldn't watch anymore. He knew what they were missing. He had heard the specific pitch of that sickening crunch. It wasn't an electrical failure. It wasn't a seized piston. It was something far more insidious and far more delicate. Before his brain could process the suicidal nature of his actions, Leo stepped out of the shadows. "It's not seized," Leo's voice cracked. 700 heads turned. The silence that followed was absolute. Bear Miller, Silas's towering sergeant-at-arms, immediately stepped into Leo's path, placing a hand the size of a dinner plate firmly on the kid's chest. Bear was a terrifying mountain of a man, his arms covered in prison ink. "Get back to the scrap heap, boy," Bear growled, his eyes narrowing, "before I snap your neck." "Let him speak." Silas's voice cut through the heavy air. He walked slowly toward Leo, his icy blue eyes analyzing the scrawny, grease-stained Runaway. "You know something my head mechanics don't, trash boy?" "They're looking at the electronics and the fuel delivery," Leo said, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "But when you turned the key, the starter motor whined at a high frequency before the crunch. The crank isn't seized. The engine is out of time. Your timing chain tensioner collapsed, and the gears locked up to prevent the valves from smashing into the pistons." Dutch scoffed from the ground. "That's impossible. Briggs used a custom pneumatic tensioner on this build. It doesn't just collapse." "No," Leo said, stepping past Bear and approaching the legendary motorcycle. "It doesn't just collapse, unless someone messed with the internal shim." A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd. The word sabotage hung in the sweltering air, unspoken but heavily implied. Silas stared at Leo for a long, agonizing moment. Then he looked at his gold Rolex. "You have exactly 20 minutes. If this bike fires up, I'll give you $10,000 in cash right now. If it doesn't, Bear is going to drag you out into the dunes, and nobody is ever going to see you again." Leo swallowed hard. He had 20 minutes to perform open-heart surgery on a masterpiece, surrounded by outlaws who would gladly watch him die. He dropped to his knees in the burning dust, shoving Dutch and Wyatt's tools aside. He didn't need a diagnostic computer. He needed feelers, a micrometer, and a socket set. Leo's hands, previously trembling, suddenly became steady the moment they touched cold metal. This was his sanctuary. He rapidly unbolted the timing cover, catching the dripping synthetic oil in a rag. As he pulled the titanium cover away, the intricate, clockwork guts of Cole Briggs's masterpiece were exposed to the desert sun. Leo leaned in closely, squinting against the glare. He reached his slender fingers into the oily abyss, navigating past the razor-sharp edges of the timing chain. He found the pneumatic tensioner. Just as he suspected, the primary locking pin was completely disengaged, but as he pulled the tensioner assembly out to inspect it, his blood ran cold. The microscopic metal shim, a tiny ring designed to keep the tensioner aligned, had been installed backwards, and it wasn't a factory defect. The edges of the shim were scarred, indicating it had been intentionally reversed recently. Someone inside the club had deliberately rigged the $2.5 million motorcycle to destroy itself the moment Silas tried to start it, in front of the entire assembly. Leo's mind raced. If he mentioned the sabotage aloud right now, a bloodbath would erupt. Paranoia would take over, and he, the outsider with his hands inside the engine, would likely be the first casualty. He had to fix it, keep his mouth shut, and survive the next 10 minutes. 10 minutes, kid, Bear sneered from above him, casting a long, dark shadow over the bike. I need a hand file, Leo demanded, his voice surprisingly firm. A fine-toothed diamond file, now. Wyatt scrambled to his toolbox and handed Leo the file. The original shim was warped beyond use. Leo dug frantically through a nearby coffee can of scrap bolts and washers that Dutch kept on his cart. He found a hardened steel washer that was roughly the same diameter. Right there, on the burning asphalt, kneeling in front of 700 silent outlaws, Leo Cassidy began to machine a custom engine, part by hand. The rhythmic shh, shh, shh of the diamond file against the steel washer was the only sound in the compound. Leo worked purely by muscle memory and spatial instinct. He filed the metal down, creating the exact bevel needed to mimic Cole Briggs's engineered design. He would check it with his micrometer, file again, check again. He was working to tolerances of thousandths of an inch, using nothing but his bare hands and raw talent. Time's up, Silas announced, his voice cold and devoid of mercy. Done, Leo breathed out. He slipped the newly fashioned steel shim into the tensioner housing, making sure the alignment was absolutely flawless. He compressed the pneumatic cylinder, locked the timing chain perfectly into place, and bolted the heavy titanium side cover back onto the engine block. He stood up, wiping his black, oily hands on his jeans. He backed away from the motorcycle. Turn the key, Leo whispered. Silas Montgomery stepped over to the Sovereign. He looked at Leo, then at the gathered masses of his empire. He reached out and turned the custom ignition key. Click. He pressed the heavy steel starter button. For a fraction of a second, the starter whined. And then, the Mojave Desert violently shook. The Sovereign detonated into life, a deafening, flawless, ground-trembling roar ripped from the custom exhaust pipes, echoing like heavy artillery off the distant mountains. The titanium engine idled perfectly, a menacing, rhythmic thumping that vibrated in the chests of every man standing there. The $2.5 million machine was alive. The tension snapped. 700 bikers erupted into a chaotic symphony of cheers, howling and revving their own engines in a thunderous salute. Silas Montgomery threw his head back and laughed, a rare, terrifying sound. He reached into his leather cut, pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, and shoved them hard into Leo's chest. "You're a goddamn wizard, kid," Silas yelled over the roar of the engine. "You belong to me now." As the crowd surged forward to admire the idling machine, Leo staggered backward, his knees weak from the adrenaline crash. He retreated to the shadows of the supply shed, clutching the $10,000 in cash. He had survived. He had actually done it. But as the cheers roared outside, Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out the original, warped shim he had removed from the engine. In the privacy of the dark shed, he wiped the oil off the tiny ring of metal. He held it up to the sliver of sunlight piercing through the corrugated roof. There, etched meticulously into the side of the tampered metal, was a microscopic maker's mark. It was a crude, tiny engraving of a bare paw. Leo's breath caught in his throat. He looked up through the dusty window of the shed. Outside, standing right behind Silas Montgomery, was Bear Miller. And Bear wasn't looking at the motorcycle. Bear was staring directly at the supply shed, his eyes locked onto the window, a look of murderous realization crossing his face. Bear knew that Leo had seen the shim. Leo hadn't just fixed a motorcycle. He had just stumbled into an assassination plot against the most dangerous man in Nevada. And the executioner knew he had the evidence. The Iron Summit compound transformed with terrifying speed from a tense arena into a chaotic, dust-choked carnival. The thunderous idol of the sovereign had acted as a starting pistol. High-octane fuel fumes mixed with the thick, greasy smoke of roasting hogs on massive spit roasters. 700 outlaws celebrated the resurrection of Cole Briggs's masterpiece, passing bottles of cheap bourbon and roaring over the heavy metal music that now blasted from towering PA speakers. Inside the suffocating heat of the corrugated steel supply shed, Leo Cassidy wasn't celebrating. He was a trapped animal, hyperventilating in the dark. He clutched the $10,000 in one hand and the sabotaged steel shim in the other. Through the grime-caked window, he watched Bear Miller. The towering sergeant-at-arms had broken away from Silas Montgomery's inner circle and was currently shoving his way through the sea of leather-clad bodies, his dark eyes locked onto the shed. Bear's path was deliberate, his massive shoulders parting the crowd like a dreadnought cutting through rough seas. Leo had exactly 30 seconds before the deadliest man in the Mojave Desert stepped through that door. Survival instinct, honed on the unforgiving south side of Chicago, overrode Leo's panic. He couldn't fight a man who had survived 3 stints in maximum security. He had to outthink him. Leo grabbed a rusted coffee can full of degreaser and violently shoved the $10,000 in cash deep to the bottom, plunging his hands into the toxic-smelling sludge to hide the bills beneath a layer of soaking wet shop rags. He then grabbed a heavy, forged steel snap-on wrench, his knuckles white, and backed into the darkest corner of the shed, right beside a stack of empty oil drums. The tin door groaned open. The heavy bass from the party outside momentarily flooded the room before the door swung shut, plunging the shed back into a dim, suffocating twilight. Bear Miller stood in the doorway. He didn't say a word at first. The silence was heavier than the desert heat. He slowly pulled a custom, serrated buck knife from a leather sheath on his belt. The metallic shook of the blade being drawn made the hairs on Leo's arms stand up. "You got lucky out there, kid," Bear said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the muffled music outside. "Lucky you found that timing issue. Lucky my president is in a generous mood." Leo swallowed the lump of terror in his throat, gripping the wrench tighter behind his leg. "Just doing the job I was told to do." Bear took a slow, heavy step forward. The floorboards creaked under his massive weight. "You have good eyes. Too good. A kid who sees things he shouldn't. Well, out here in the desert, those kinds of kids tend to have short lifespans. They wander off into the alkali flats, and the coyotes scatter their bones." Bear stopped 3 feet away. The smell of stale whiskey, chewing tobacco, and raw aggression radiated from him. "Hand it over," Bear whispered, holding out his massive, calloused palm. "Give me the scrap metal you pulled from the tensioner housing, and maybe I'll let you walk out the front gate tonight." Leo's mind raced. If he handed over the shim with the bear paw engraving, he gave up his only leverage. Bear would slit his throat the second the evidence was secured, bury him out back, and tell Silas the runaway had stolen a motorcycle and bolted with the cash. "I threw it in the scrap bucket on Dutch's cart," Leo lied, his voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. "It was warped. It's trash." Bear's eyes narrowed into slits. He lunged, his massive hand snapping forward with the speed of a striking rattlesnake. He grabbed Leo by the throat, slamming the 22-year-old mechanic against the corrugated tin wall with bone-jarring force. The heavy wrench clattered to the floor. Leo gagged, his feet dangling 2 inches off the ground as Bear's grip crushed his windpipe. "Don't lie to me, you little rat!" Bear hissed, pressing the cold, serrated edge of the buck knife against Leo's ribs. "I saw you pocket it. I know you looked at it. You think Silas is going to believe a homeless drifter over his own blood brother? I'll gut you right here and say I caught you stealing parts." Black spots danced in Leo's vision. He was losing oxygen fast. His hands scrabbled desperately against the steel wall, searching for anything. His right hand knocked against a pressurized canister of commercial-grade carburetor cleaner sitting on a shelf. With his last ounce of conscious strength, Leo grabbed the aerosol can, shoved the nozzle directly into Bear's face, and pressed the trigger. A high-pressure stream of toxic, highly flammable acetone blasted directly into Bear's eyes. The giant roared in agonizing pain, dropping Leo and clawing furiously at his own face. The knife clattered against the oil drums. Leo hit the floor, gasping violently for air. He didn't waste a millisecond. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed the rusted coffee can containing the money from the workbench, and bolted out the door into the blinding, chaotic glare of the compound. Leo hit the crowd running. He kept his head down, weaving frantically between the throngs of intoxicated bikers, dodging roaring fire pits and revving motorcycles. He knew Bear would be blind for only a few minutes. Once the enforcer flushed his eyes, a brutal, organized hunt would begin. The front gates were heavily guarded by Bear's loyal prospects. Leaving via the main road was a death sentence. Leo's only chance lay at the northern edge of the compound, the boneyard. It was a sprawling, fenced-in acreage where the club dumped wrecked frames, blown engines, and stolen vehicles stripped for parts. For the past 3 weeks, under the guise of organizing scrap, Leo had been quietly cannibalizing parts to rebuild a wrecked 1998 Yamaha Wise 250 dirt bike he had found buried under a pile of rusted fenders. It wasn't a $2.5 million masterpiece, but it was light, aggressive, and possessed a suspension built to absorb the punishing Mojave terrain. As Leo sprinted toward the boneyard, he realized something terrifying. Escaping wasn't enough. Bear was a high-ranking officer in a global syndicate. With his connections, Bear could track Leo down anywhere in the country. To truly survive, Leo had to destroy Bear from the inside. He needed Silas to know the truth. Suddenly, Leo saw Dutch. The head mechanic was standing near a keg, laughing with 2 other patched members, his heavy leather cut hanging open. Leo made a split-second decision. He altered his trajectory, deliberately stumbling hard into Dutch, spilling the mechanic's beer all over the dirt. "Watch it, you little punk!" Dutch barked, shoving Leo backward. Sorry, man, someone pushed me," Leo stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. But in the brief second of the collision, Leo's sleight of hand, perfected from years of surviving the streets, went to work. He slipped the sabotaged steel shim, wrapped tightly in a greasy scrap of paper, directly into the deep breast pocket of Dutch's leather vest. On the paper, Leo had frantically scrawled 3 words with a grease pencil. "Look at it." Dutch waved him off in disgust. Leo turned and vanished into the shadows, sprinting toward the rusted chain-link fence of the boneyard. He knew Dutch's obsessive mechanical mind. When Dutch found a random engine part in his pocket, he wouldn't throw it away. He would inspect it under a magnifying glass. He would see the bare paw engraving, and he would take it straight to Silas. Leo reached the back corner of the boneyard. Hidden beneath a ratty, sun-bleached tarp was the Yamaha YZ250. He ripped the tarp away. He fished the dripping, solvent-soaked stacks of $100 bills out of the coffee can and shoved them into his jacket pockets. He didn't have the key for the Yamaha. He pulled a pair of Knipex pliers from his back pocket, stripped the ignition wires with his teeth, and twisted the copper threads together. The dashboard flickered to life. Suddenly, a massive spotlight swept across the boneyard, illuminating the rusted chassis of dead cars. Over the roar of the party, Leo heard the furious, unmistakable roar of heavy V-twin engines firing up. Bear had recovered. "There he is!" a voice yelled from the edge of the scrap heap. Two heavy Harley-Davidson Diner Street Bobs, ridden by Bear's enforcers, Griff and Maddox, smashed through a stack of wooden pallets, their headlights pinning Leo against the fence. Bear rode behind them on a massive, blacked-out road glide. Leo threw his leg over the Yamaha and kicked the starter with everything he had. The two-stroke engine shrieked to life, a high-pitched, aggressive wail that sounded like a chainsaw tearing through metal. He dropped the clutch, the rear knobby tire biting hard into the dirt, kicking up a massive roost of sand. He aimed the Yamaha directly at a weak section of corrugated tin fencing at the back of the lot. He hit the fence at 40 miles an hour, smashing through the rusted metal and launching out into the pitch-black void of the open Mojave Desert. The chase was on. The three heavy Harleys roared through the breach right behind him. The desert night was instantly illuminated by their blazing halogen headlights. Leo pushed the Yamaha to its absolute limit. He was riding blind, relying solely on the faint moonlight reflecting off the pale alkali dust. He heard the thunder of the Harleys closing in. On a paved highway, the massive 110 cubic-inch engines would run him down in seconds. But out here, in the deep sand and jagged rocks, weight was the enemy. Leo veered sharply to the right, aiming for a treacherous, dried-out riverbed, known as a sand wash. He dropped a gear and pinned the throttle, the lightweight dirt bike skimming violently over the deep, loose sand. Behind him, Griff and Maddox tried to follow. The heavy front ends of their custom Harleys immediately ploughed into the deep sand. Griff's front tire washed out, sending the 700-pound motorcycle violently tumbling end over end into the dark, launching the enforcer over the handlebars. Bear, furious, refused to yield. He kept his road glide on the harder-packed ridge above the wash, paralleling Leo's path, pacing him in the dark. Bear pulled a heavy, matte-black revolver from his cut, taking one-handed shots into the dark. The cracks of gunfire echoed off the distant canyon walls, kicking up geysers of sand inches from Leo's tires. Leo needed to end this. Up ahead, he saw the jagged silhouette of a narrow slot canyon, a fissure in the rock face carved by flash floods. It was barely wide enough for a horse, let alone a heavily modified touring motorcycle. Leo aimed the Yamaha directly at the black crack in the earth. He hit the rocky incline, the dirt bike's suspension soaking up the punishing boulders. He slipped into the narrow canyon, the rock walls instantly scraping the sides of his boots. Bear, blinded by rage and adrenaline, realized too late that his road glide was too wide for the gap. He slammed on the brakes, locking up the rear tire, but the momentum was too great. The heavy cruiser smashed violently into the solid granite wall of the canyon entrance. Metal shrieked, fiberglass shattered, and the desert fell suddenly, terrifyingly silent behind him. Leo didn't look back. He kept the throttle pinned, navigating the twisting, claustrophobic canyon until he burst out the other side. Miles later, the rugged desert terrain gave way to cracked asphalt. Leo rolled to a stop at the edge of the legendary Route 66, entirely alone, under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars. The Yamaha idled beneath him, hot and smelling of burnt oil. He reached into his jacket, his trembling fingers brushing against the thick, solvent-soaked stacks of cash. Back at the iron summit, Dutch was pulling a small, greasy piece of metal out of his pocket, his eyes widening as he recognized the microscopic bare paw engraved on the side. The predator had become the prey. The cold desert wind whipped across Leo's face as the taillights of the heavy cruisers faded into the dusty abyss. He had $10,000 strapped to his chest and a battered Yamaha beneath him. The debt to Carmine Rossi was as good as paid. He wasn't just a scared runaway anymore. He was the mechanic who outsmarted the devil himself. The vast, open road stretched out. Finally his own. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. In her trembling hands rested a single, slightly bruised turkey sandwich, her only lifeline in the freezing Reno rain. But when a guttural groan echoed from the pitch-black alley, 19-year-old Fiona had to make a choice. Save herself or save a dying monster. The wind off the Sierra Nevadas didn't just blow through Reno. It hunted. It found every tear in 19-year-old Fiona Adams' thin denim jacket, biting into her ribs with the ferocity of a wild animal. It was mid-November, and the city's neon glow reflected off the rain-slicked pavement like shattered stained glass, offering light but absolutely no warmth. Fiona was a ghost in her own life. After aging out of a broken foster care system in Oregon, a string of bad luck, stolen backpacks and predatory landlords had left her on the unforgiving streets of Nevada. For the past 3 days, her reality had been defined by a hollow, gnawing ache in her stomach that had slowly transitioned from sharp pain to a dizzying, terrifying numbness. But tonight, she had a miracle wrapped in crinkled foil. Tucked safely inside her jacket, pressed against her chest to keep it dry, was a thick turkey and Swiss sandwich. A sympathetic diner cook named Arthur had handed it to her through the back alley door of the Silver Spoon, just as they were locking up. "Get out of the rain, kid," he had muttered, slipping her the foil package. It felt as heavy as a gold brick. She had planned to take it to her makeshift shelter, a dry enclave behind the rusted loading docks of an abandoned textile warehouse, and savor every single bite. It was enough calories to keep her going for another 2 days if she rationed it. As Fiona hurried down the darkened industrial corridor of 4th Street, her worn canvas sneakers splashing through icy puddles, the rhythmic drumming of the rain was suddenly pierced by a sound that made her freeze. It was a heavy, wet cough, followed by the undeniable sound of a large body slumping against a brick wall. Every street instinct Fiona possessed screamed at her to keep walking. In this part of town, curiosity wasn't just dangerous, it was often fatal. But as she took a step forward, a jagged flash of lightning illuminated the narrow alleyway to her left. Lying in a pile of discarded wooden pallets and wet trash was a man. He wasn't just large, he was colossal, easily pushing 250 pounds of muscle and leather. Beside him lay a crushed, custom-built Harley-Davidson motorcycle, its front wheel bent at a grotesque angle, the headlight shattered. Fiona took a cautious step backward, ready to bolt, but the stench hit her then, the sharp, unmistakable copper tang of fresh blood mixing with the smell of spilled gasoline. Against her better judgment, Fiona crept closer, the shadows swallowing her. The man was clutching his lower abdomen, his massive, calloused fingers slick with dark crimson. He wore a heavy leather vest, the back of which she couldn't see, but the front bore a series of patches. The unmistakable red-on-white lettering spelled out Hell's Angels on the top rocker, with a Nevada patch sitting just below his shoulder. He was a patched member of the most notorious motorcycle club in the world, and he was dying. "Hey," Fiona whispered, her voice trembling. "Hey, are you okay?" The man's head snapped toward her. Even through the blood loss and the rain, his eyes were terrifying, pale, piercing blue, set deep into a scarred, weathered face. A jagged scar ran from his left ear down to his collarbone. "Get the hell away from me," he growled, though his voice lacked the booming authority it surely usually possessed. He coughed again, a wet, rattling sound, and his head rolled back against the wet brick. Fiona should have run. This was gang business. If whoever did this to him came back, she would be nothing but collateral damage. but as she watched his chest heave, struggling for air, she didn't see a terrifying biker. She saw a human being whose life was draining into the filthy Reno gutters. She dropped to her knees beside him, the cold puddle soaking instantly through her jeans. "You're bleeding out," she said, panic edging her voice. She reached out, hesitating before pressing her hands over his massive, blood-soaked ones on his abdomen. "Don't touch me," he snarled, trying to shove her away, but his arm was weak, trembling violently. "Stop fighting me," Fiona yelled back, surprised by her own sudden ferocity. "If you don't put pressure on this, you're going to die right here in the garbage." The biker blinked, seemingly shocked by the audacity of the scrawny, soaked teenager yelling at him. He stopped resisting. Fiona stripped off her only dry garment, a thick woolen scarf she had found at a donation bin, and pressed it hard against the deep laceration just above his hip. It looked like a knife wound, deep and jagged. "What's your name?" Fiona asked, trying to keep him awake as his eyes began to flutter. "Jim," he gritted out, his jaw clenched tight against the agonizing pain. "They call me Big Jim. Jim McCall." "Okay, Jim, I'm Fiona. You need an ambulance." "No cops," Jim wheezed, grabbing her wrist with a sudden, iron grip that made her gasp. "No, paramedics. Club handles its own. My brothers, they'll come." "How? Your phone?" Fiona looked around frantically. Jim nodded weakly toward his leather jacket pocket. Fiona reached in, her fingers slipping on his blood, and pulled out a heavy, shattered smartphone. The screen was completely destroyed from the crash. "It's dead," Fiona said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Jim, it's broken. I don't have a phone. I have to go get help." But as she tried to stand, Jim's massive frame began to convulse. It wasn't just the shivering from the cold or the blood loss. His skin turned an ashen, sickly grey, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead, mingling with the rain. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. "Jim? Jim!" Fiona shook his shoulder. His eyes rolled back. "Insulin," he mumbled, his words slurring so badly they were barely recognizable. "Crashed. Sugar. Dropping." Fiona froze. The blood loss was bad, but the diabetic shock was going to kill him in minutes. His brain was starving for glucose. She frantically patted down his pockets, searching for candy, a gel pack, anything. Nothing. Her hands flew to her own chest, feeling the crinkled foil hidden inside her jacket. The turkey sandwich, the bread, the sweet cranberry mayonnaise, the thick slices of meat. It was pure carbohydrates and sugar. It was her survival. Fiona's stomach let out a violent, painful cramp, as if her own body was protesting the thought forming in her mind. If she gave this up, she would be back to starving. She might pass out from hunger herself tomorrow. She had literally nothing else in the world. She looked down at the terrifying Hell's Angel. Jim McCall, a man whose reputation alone would normally make civilians cross the street in fear, was reduced to a helpless, trembling giant. He was slipping into a diabetic coma, right here in the freezing rain. With trembling fingers, Fiona unzipped her jacket and pulled out the foil package. She unwrapped it quickly, the smell of roasted turkey and fresh bread hitting her senses so hard it brought tears to her eyes. She broke off a piece of the bread, heavily coated in the sweet cranberry mayo. "Jim," she commanded, her voice cracking. She tapped his cheek hard. "Jim, open your mouth. You have to eat this. Now." He groaned, his jaw locked tight in a minor convulsion. "Open it," she pleaded, practically prying his lips apart and shoving the piece of sweet, carb-heavy bread inside. "Chew. Please, you have to swallow." Instinct seemed to take over. Jim swallowed the first bite. Fiona broke off another, larger piece, turkey, cheese, and bread, and fed it to him. Bite by bite, In the freezing, blood-soaked alley, the starving homeless girl fed her only meal to the dying biker. She watched her survival disappear into his mouth, suppressing the desperate urge to cry. By the time she fed him the last crust, her hands were shaking violently. She sat back on her heels, exhausted, drenched, and entirely empty-handed. For 5 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. The rain continued to pour, washing the blood down the sloping asphalt. Fiona kept the pressure applied to his side with her ruined scarf, praying she hadn't just wasted her food for nothing. Slowly, the violent tremors began to subside. The ashen color in Jim's face retreated, replaced by a pale but living hue. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his piercing blue eyes blinking open. They focused on Fiona, then dropped to the empty, torn foil wrapper sitting in her lap. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stared at her, assessing the soaked, shivering teenager who had just pulled him back from the brink of death. "You," Jim started, his voice a hoarse rasp. "You didn't have to do that." "You were dying," Fiona said simply, wiping the rain from her eyes. "I couldn't just watch." Jim shifted, wincing as the pain in his side flared up, but the sugar had worked. His cognitive functions were returning. The immediate threat of the diabetic crash had passed. He reached into the inner pocket of his cut and pulled out a small, old-school flip phone. A burner. "Primary got smashed," he muttered, dialing a number from memory with bloody fingers. He held it to his ear. "Deacon," Jim said into the phone, his tone instantly shifting into something cold, hard, and authoritative. "It's Jim. I'm down in the West Alley off 4th, near the old textile plant. The Vipers ambushed me. Yeah, took a blade to the ribs, but I'm stable. Bike's trashed. Bring the van. And Deacon, bring everyone." He snapped the phone shut and looked back at Fiona. The look in his eyes was intense, almost unnerving. "You need to leave," Jim told her, his voice low but firm. "My club is coming. The Vipers might come back to finish the job before they get here. This is going to be a bloodbath, kid. You don't want to be anywhere near this." Fiona nodded, fear finally overriding her adrenaline. She stood up, her legs numb from the cold concrete. "Wait," Jim called out. He reached out and grabbed her wrist one last time, much gentler now. "What's your full name, kid?" "Fiona. Fiona Adams." "Where do you sleep, Fiona Adams?" She hesitated, her street smarts flaring. "You never tell a stranger where your camp is." But there was a strange, unbreakable gravity in the biker's eyes. "Behind the loading docks," she whispered. "The old Henderson textile warehouse, under the rusted awning." Jim nodded once, releasing her hand. "Go, stay hidden." Fiona didn't look back. She sprinted down the alley, her wet shoes slapping the pavement, disappearing into the shadows just as the distant wail of sirens began to echo from the north side of the city. She crawled into her damp sleeping bag behind the loading docks an hour later. The hunger returned with a vengeance, a sharp, twisting agony in her gut. She curled into a tight ball, tears finally spilling hot down her freezing cheeks. She had done the right thing, she told herself. She had saved a life. But as the cold set into her bones, she wondered if she had just traded her own life for his. Sleep eventually took her, a fitful, exhausted state of unconsciousness. She didn't know how long she slept, but she woke up with a violent start. The ground was shaking. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a rhythmic, thunderous vibration that seemed to reverberate in her very teeth. Fiona scrambled out of her sleeping bag, her heart hammering in her throat. The rain had stopped, replaced by the pale grey light of early morning. The low, guttural roar grew louder, bouncing off the brick walls of the industrial district. It sounded like an army of mechanical beasts. Fiona peeked her head around the rusted metal of the loading dock, her breath catching in her throat. Pouring down the deserted street, turning the corner in a perfectly synchronized, terrifying formation, was a sea of chrome and leather. One after another, massive Harley-Davidsons rolled into view. It wasn't 10 or 20. The line stretched back further than the eye could see, filling the entire avenue. 2 by 2 they rode, their engines creating a deafening symphony of power. The men riding them wore matching cuts, the death head logo of the Hells Angels standing out starkly in the morning mist. They weren't just passing through, they were slowing down. 300 Hells Angels were pulling into the abandoned lot of the Henderson Textile Warehouse, forming a massive perimeter, and leading the pack, riding a pristine black chopper, was a man with a skull tattooed on his neck, his eyes scanning the rusted awnings until they locked directly onto the spot where Fiona was hiding. They had come for her. The deafening roar of 300 V-twin engines vibrating against the brick walls of the alleyway was a physical force. It rattled the loose corrugated tin of the warehouse roof and vibrated through the worn soles of Fiona's sneakers. She was trapped. There was no back exit from the loading dock, just a chain-link fence topped with razor wire that she could never scale in time. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. "They're tying up loose ends," she thought, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I know too much. I saw a patched member bleeding out in an alley. I know the Vipers did it. In the brutal, unforgiving underworld of gang warfare, witnesses were liabilities. The sea of motorcycles came to a coordinated, rumbling halt. The sudden silence that followed the killing of 300 engines was somehow more terrifying than the noise. The air was thick with the smell of hot exhaust, burning oil, and damp leather. The man at the front, the one riding the black chopper with the skull tattoo creeping up his neck, kicked down his stand. He was tall, lean but corded with muscle, with a silver-streaked beard and a heavy leather cut that bore the President patch over his heart. His name tag read Deacon. Deacon dismounted slowly, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. Behind him, dozens of massive men dismounted in unison, their faces stoic, their eyes scanning the perimeter. A few of them rested their hands casually near their waistbands. They were locking down the entire city block. "Fiona Adams!" Deacon called out. His voice wasn't a yell, but it carried effortlessly across the damp morning air, deep and resonant. Fiona pressed herself harder against the rusted metal pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could dissolve into the damp concrete. "We know you're back there, kid," Deacon said, his tone surprisingly steady. "Big Jim gave us the exact coordinates. Come on out. Nobody here is going to lay a finger on you. You have my word as president of the Nevada Charter." Trembling violently, Fiona slowly peeked around the rusted iron beam. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto her. She stepped out into the pale morning light, her clothes still damp from the night before, her shoulders hunched defensively. She looked entirely insignificant, standing before an army of the world's most feared motorcycle club. Deacon approached her, stopping a respectful 10 feet away. Up close, his eyes were a weary steel grey. He looked her up and down, taking in her bruised, shivering frame, her soaking wet sneakers, and the absolute terror in her eyes. "You the one who found Jim McCall last night?" Deacon asked. Fiona nodded, her voice completely failing her. She swallowed hard, forcing a whisper. Is he dead?" A heavy silence fell over the front row of bikers. Deacon's jaw tightened. He flatlined in the ambulance, lost 3 pints of blood, and went into severe hypoglycemic shock. Fiona's knees buckled slightly, a wave of despair washing over her. She had given up her only food, her only chance at fighting off the gnawing hunger, and it hadn't been enough. she had failed. But, Deacon continued, taking a step forward and raising a heavily tattooed hand, they brought him back. He's in the ICU at Washoe Medical. Surgeon says if his blood sugar had been just a fraction lower when he was waiting for us to arrive, his brain would have shut down completely. He wouldn't have made it to the operating table. Deacon reached into his cut and pulled out a small, crinkled piece of aluminum foil. It was the wrapper from her turkey sandwich. Jim woke up for 2 minutes post-op, Deacon said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur that only Fiona and the closest men could hear. He handed me this, said a homeless kid with nothing to her name shoved her last meal down his throat to keep him from slipping into a diabetic coma while the vipers were circling the block looking to finish the job. Deacon looked back at his men, then back to Fiona. You know who Jim McCall is, kid? Fiona shook her head frantically. He said he was Big Jim. Big Jim is the international sergeant-at-arms for this club, Deacon stated, the gravity of the title hanging heavily in the air. He's the founding father of the West Coast Coalition. If he died last night, this city would have burned to the ground by midnight. We would have started a war that would have left dozens dead. By keeping him breathing, you didn't just save a biker, Fiona. You saved Reno from a bloodbath. Suddenly, the screech of tires shattered the moment. 2 Reno Police Department cruisers came tearing around the corner, their sirens blaring, lights flashing, cutting off the street. 3 officers leapt out, hands resting nervously on their holstered weapons. They had clearly received calls about a massive biker gathering in the industrial district. "All right, break it up!" the lead officer yelled, looking incredibly pale as he realized he was staring down 300 Hell's Angels. It was Officer Miller, a local beat cop Fiona knew well. He was the same cop who had kicked her awake a week ago and told her to go freeze somewhere else when she sought shelter in a bus stop. Deacon didn't even flinch. He slowly turned his back to Fiona and walked toward the cruisers. "Morning, officer. Just out for a morning ride." Taking a breather. "You can't block a public street, Deacon," Miller stammered, his eyes darting to the sheer number of men surrounding the warehouse. "And what are you doing with the vagrant?" He pointed a judgmental finger at Fiona. Deacon stopped inches from the officer. The entire army of bikers shifted forward a single collective half-step. The sound of their boots scraping the asphalt sounded like a rock slide. The officers froze. "This young lady," Deacon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register, "is under the direct protection of the Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club. She isn't a vagrant. She's family. And if I ever hear you, or anyone else in this city, refer to her as a problem again, my brothers and I will take it as a personal insult. Are we clear?" Officer Miller swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the pavement. "Clear. Good. Now, we're going to escort our friend to breakfast. You boys have a safe shift." Deacon turned his back on the police, completely dismissing them, and walked back to Fiona. Fiona stood frozen as the police cruisers slowly backed up and drove away, entirely intimidated by the overwhelming show of force. Deacon stopped in front of her again, his expression softening into something that looked incredibly out of place on a hardened biker. Profound gratitude. "You gave up your only meal," Deacon said softly. "You were starving and you fed a stranger." "He was dying," Fiona whispered, clutching her arms around herself as the wind picked up again. "It was the right thing to do." "Well, out here, the right thing rarely goes unpunished," Deacon replied. "But not today." He snapped his fingers over his shoulder. From the middle of the pack, a massive panel van pulled up. The back doors swung open, and 2 heavily tattooed men stepped out carrying a large insulated catering box. They brought it over to the loading dock and opened it. The smell of fresh, hot food, bacon, eggs, roasted potatoes and sweet coffee, hit Fiona's senses so hard she actually swayed on her feet. "Eat," Deacon commanded gently. "Nobody goes hungry on our watch, especially not the girl who saved Big Jim." Fiona didn't need to be told twice. She sat on an overturned crate and ate like she hadn't seen food in a year, tears of sheer relief streaming down her face and mixing with her meal. The 300 bikers didn't rush her. They stood watch, a silent, impenetrable wall of leather and steel, guarding a homeless teenager while she ate breakfast. When she finally couldn't eat another bite, Deacon crouched down next to her. "Here's the twist of it all, Fiona," Deacon said, pulling a thick manila envelope from his leather jacket. "Jim didn't just get ambushed randomly. He was set up. Someone inside our own circle leaked his route to the Vipers." Fiona's eyes widened. "A traitor?" Deacon nodded grimly. "When Jim went down, his blood sugar crashed. He was completely disoriented. He told me this morning that before you shoved that sandwich in his mouth, he was hallucinating. He couldn't remember who set the meeting. But the sugar, the food you gave him, it snapped his brain back into reality just long enough." Deacon leaned in closer. "Before he passed out in that alley, he texted me one name on his burner phone. The name of the rat in our club. We handled the problem 3 hours ago. If you hadn't fed him, he would have slipped into a coma, forgotten the name, and the traitor would have dismantled our club from the inside out." He placed the thick envelope in Fiona's lap. "You didn't just save Jim. You saved the entire Nevada Charter. We owe you a life debt." Fiona tentatively opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of crisp $100 bills, more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. But beneath the cash was something else, a set of keys and a signed lease agreement. "That's a 2-bedroom apartment over on Elm Street," Deacon explained. "Rent is paid in full for the next 5 years. The neighborhood is safe. We made sure of it." I can't take this," Fiona stammered, her hands shaking as she touched the keys. "It was just a turkey sandwich." "To you it was a sandwich," a voice called out. The crowd of bikers parted down the middle, rolling through the gap in a standard hospital wheelchair, pushed by a giant biker with a thick red beard, was Jim McCall. He was pale, hooked up to a portable IV drip, and heavily bandaged around his midsection, but his piercing blue eyes were sharp and awake. He had demanded to leave the hospital against medical advice just to be here. "To me, it was a second chance at life," Jim rasped, offering a weak but genuine smile. "I don't forget a debt, kid." Jim signaled to the man pushing him, who handed Jim a folded piece of black leather. Jim held it out to Fiona. It was a heavy, high-quality leather jacket. On the front right breast, embroidered in stark, undeniable lettering, it read, "Friend of the Hells Angels, Nevada." "You wear that," Jim said, his voice echoing in the quiet alley. "You wear that anywhere in this state, and nobody, not the police, not the street gangs, not the landlords, will ever mess with you again. You are under our umbrella now. You have 300 brothers watching your back." Fiona took the jacket, the heavy leather feeling like armor in her hands. She slipped it over her thin shoulders. It was warm, heavy, and smelled of cedar and the open road. For the first time in years, the crushing, suffocating feeling of being utterly alone in the world vanished. "There's one more thing," Deacon said, standing up. "My wife runs the books at Ironclad Custom Motors, legitimate shop. We need someone sharp to handle inventory and customer intake. It pays $25 an hour, full benefits. You start Monday, if you want it." Fiona looked from Deacon to the keys in her hand, to Jim in his wheelchair, and finally to the massive army of bikers standing silently in the morning sun. The freezing rain of yesterday felt like a lifetime ago. She wasn't a ghost anymore. "I want it," Fiona said, a real, genuine smile breaking across her face for the first time in a very long time. "Thank you." "Mount up!" Deacon roared, the command echoing off the buildings. 300 riders swung their legs over their bikes. The deafening symphony of engines roared to life, shaking the earth once again. But this time, the sound didn't terrify Fiona. It sounded like a choir. Deacon pointed to a pristine, custom-built trike near the front. "Your carriage awaits, Miss Adams. Let's go see your new home." As Fiona climbed onto the back of the trike, surrounded by a roaring escort of chrome and leather, she looked back at the cold, empty loading dock where she had almost starved to death. She had given away her last crumb of survival to a monster in the dark, only to find out that sometimes the monsters are the only ones capable of pulling you into the light. True kindness is rarely a calculated investment. It is a desperate leap of faith in the darkest of moments. Fiona gave away her survival to a stranger, expecting nothing but the cold reality of starvation in return. Instead, her selfless sacrifice rippled through a dangerous underworld, proving that compassion holds more power than violence. In the end, the smallest crumb of humanity can summon an army of salvation.